The old soldier walked slowly into the amphitheater. His name was Or, and he had served the Dominion for 40 cycles. His body showed the marks of countless battles. Deep scars ran across his hard carapace like rivers on a map. One of his 4 arms was mechanical, a replacement for the limb he lost on a world whose name he had tried to forget. His eyes, once bright amber, had faded to a dull orange from age and too many memories. The young cadets watched him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. They sat in rows that curved upward like the inside of a shell. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across their eager faces. These were the future warriors of the Dominion. They had studied tactics, learned to use weapons, and trained their bodies for combat. But they had never seen real war. They had never smelled burning flesh or heard the screams of dying soldiers, or reached the center of the amphitheater and stood before a simple metal chair. He did not sit. Instead, he looked up at the hundreds of young faces staring down at him. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence grew heavy. A senior instructor stepped forward. His name was Commander Al, and he had arranged this lecture. He cleared his throat and addressed the cadets. Today you will hear from one of our most decorated veterans, or has fought in 12 major campaigns across 9 star systems. He has faced enemies that would make your blood freeze. Listen carefully to his words, for they may one day save your lives. Al turned to Or and gave a respectful nod. Then he stepped back into the shadows. Or finally spoke. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "You want to know about war," he said. "You want to know what it feels like to face death. You think you are ready. You think your training has prepared you." He paused and let out a low clicking sound that served as bitter laughter among his kind. "You know nothing." The cadets shifted uncomfortably. Some of them frowned. They had trained hard and did not like being told they were ignorant, but none of them dared to speak. "I have fought many species," Or continued. "I have faced the swarms, the juggernauts, the assassins. All of them were dangerous. All of them killed soldiers I called friends, but none of them frightened me, not truly." He let that sink in before speaking again. "There is only one species that keeps me awake at night. Only one species that makes my hearts beat faster when I remember them. They are called humans." A ripple of surprise went through the cadets. Several of them laughed openly. Humans were known throughout the galaxy as a young species. They had only been traveling between stars for about 300 cycles. They were soft creatures with weak bodies. They had no claws, no armor, no natural weapons. How could such beings be frightening? Or did not react to their laughter. He simply waited until they fell quiet again. "I see you find this amusing," he said. "Good. Hold on to that feeling. Remember it. Because when you face humans in battle, that laughter will die in your throat." The amphitheater became silent once more. "I first encountered humans during the Terminus War," Or explained. "The Empire had expanded too far, too fast. They threatened trade routes and colony worlds belonging to a dozen different species. The Galactic Coalition was formed to stop them. We joined the fight, as did and many others. And then the humans came." He began to pace slowly, his mechanical arm clicking softly with each step. "They sent a fleet called the United Earth Expeditionary Force. At first, we did not take them seriously. Their ships were smaller than ours. Their weapons seemed crude. Their soldiers looked fragile. We thought they had come to watch and learn, not to fight." Or stopped packing and turned to face the cadets directly. "We were fools." He told them about his first mission alongside human soldiers. It was a simple operation, or so they had been told. A coalition squad was sent to clear an outpost on a moon called 3. The squad included 12 warriors, 8 heavy gunners, and 6 humans from something called the Marine Corps. Among the humans was a soldier named Danny Vance, Or remembered him clearly. Danny was of average height for a human, with short brown hair and pale skin covered in strange markings he called tattoos. He spoke quietly and smiled often. He carried a weapon that seemed too small to be effective and wore armor that looked like it would crack under a single plasma bolt. Or admitted that he had dismissed Danny as weak. He expected the human to hang back during combat, to let the stronger species do the real fighting. He could not have been more wrong. The mission went bad almost immediately. They had been expecting them. The outpost was a trap. Within seconds of entering the compound, the squad was surrounded by enemy fire. Plasma bolts filled the air like burning rain. 3 fell in the first volley. 2 were cut down trying to find cover. And then Orr saw something that changed everything he believed about humans. Danny Vance moved through the chaos like water flowing around stones. He did not panic. He did not freeze. He ran directly into the enemy fire, grabbed a wounded soldier and dragged him behind a broken wall. Then he went back for another, and another. Or watched in disbelief as Danny took 2 plasma bolts to his right shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him to the ground. Any other species would have stayed down. Any other species would have screamed in pain and waited for death. Danny got back up. He rose to his feet with blood pouring down his arm. His face was twisted in pain, but his eyes were calm, cold, focused. He picked up his weapon with his remaining good arm and started moving forward again. When his weapon ran empty, he pulled out a combat knife. A knife, against enemies with plasma rifles and energy shields. And he kept fighting. Or had seen bravery before. He had seen soldiers sacrifice themselves for their comrades, but he had never seen anything like Danny Vance. The human fought as if death was simply an obstacle to be ignored. He fought as if pain was just a distraction. He fought with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal and terrifying. By the time reinforcements arrived, Danny had killed 9 soldiers. 9, with 1 working arm and a knife. Or looked at the silent cadets and spoke his final words for this part of his story. That was the day I learned the truth about humans. They are not weak. They are not fragile. They are the most dangerous creatures I have ever encountered. And if you ever face them in battle, you should pray to whatever gods you believe in. Because humans do not know how to quit. They do not know how to surrender. They only know how to fight until they win or until they die. He paused and let the weight of his words fill the amphitheater. And sometimes, he added quietly, even death does not stop them or let the cadets absorb his first story. He could see the doubt fading from their young faces. Some of them had stopped breathing. Others gripped the edges of their seats with all 4 hands. Good. They were beginning to understand. He walked to a small table at the edge of the amphitheater and poured himself a glass of water. His throat was dry from speaking, and the memories he was sharing made his heart ache. But the cadets needed to hear these things. They needed to know what awaited them among the stars. After taking a long drink, Orr returned to the center of the room. He set down the glass and folded his arms across his chest. My second encounter with human warriors happened on a moon called 7, he began. It was a mining colony at the edge of Coalition space. The wanted its resources. We were sent to stop them. He explained that the Coalition force was large and well supplied. They had orbital support from 3 warships and ground troops from 6 different species. Victory seemed certain, but war is never certain. War is chaos wearing a uniform. They came with twice the force's intelligence had predicted. They brought heavy artillery that pounded the Coalition positions day and night. They jammed communications and shot down supply ships. Within 2 weeks, the defenders were cut off, low on ammunition, and running out of food. Orr was among the troops stationed at a location called Hollow Ridge. It was a network of trenches and bunkers built into the rocky terrain. There were about 400 soldiers there, representing 5 different species. And humans. As supplies dwindled and casualties mounted, something strange happened. The alien soldiers began to lose hope. Warriors, trained from birth to face death without fear, started to break. Gunners, famous for their stubbornness, began talking about surrender. Even the cold and calculating seemed ready to give up. But the humans did not break, or remembered watching them with growing amazement. While other species argued and panicked, the humans remained calm. They shared their rations with hungry allies. They tended to wounded soldiers who were not their own kind. They told jokes and stories to keep morale alive. And when every senior officer had been killed, a human stepped forward to take command. Her name was Cole. She was a staff sergeant, barely 30 cycles old by human counting. Among, she would have been considered a child. She had short red hair, pale skin dotted with brown spots she called freckles, and green eyes that seemed to see right through anyone who looked at her. Gathered the surviving officers and spoke to them plainly. She did not give a rousing speech. She did not make promises she could not keep. She simply told them what needed to be done and how they were going to do it. "We hold until reinforcements arrive," she said. "We ration what we have. We rotate rest shifts. We support each other. And we do not give them a single meter of ground." Some of the alien officers protested. They outranked her. They came from proud warrior cultures. Who was this human female to give them orders? Looked at them without anger or pride. She simply asked one question. "Do you have a better plan?" They did not, and so they followed her. Under her leadership, the defenders of Hollow Ridge organized themselves into an effective fighting force. She assigned tasks based on each species' strengths, held the front lines, operated the heavy weapons, conducted night raids, managed logistics, and humans filled the gaps wherever they were needed. Or told the cadets about the night they breached the eastern barricade. It happened during the 3rd week of the siege. The enemy had concentrated their assault on a weak point in the defenses. They poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. Was on the other side of the compound when the breach occurred. By the time she arrived, the situation was desperate. Soldiers were flooding into the trenches, cutting down defenders with brutal efficiency. Did not hesitate. She gathered the nearest soldiers and led them straight into the breach. There were only 7 of them, and 6 other humans. Briggs, a tall man with a shaved head and hands like stone. Nate Tanner, young and fast with nervous energy that never stopped. Marsh, quiet and deadly, who rarely spoke but never missed a shot. Ben, built like a cargo loader who carried a weapon meant for vehicles. Amy, small but fierce, with medical supplies strapped to every part of her body. And Chris, the oldest of them, gray-haired and calm, who had seen more battles than anyone could count. These 7 humans held the breach for 19 hours. Or paused to let that sink in. 19 hours, against a continuous assault, with no reinforcements, limited ammunition, and wounds that would have killed soldiers of other species. He described what he saw when he finally reached the eastern barricade. The ground was covered with bodies, dozens of them, piled on top of each other like broken machines, and standing among the dead were the only 2 humans still on their feet. Both of them were covered in blood. Their uniforms were torn. Their faces were pale from exhaustion and blood loss, had a piece of metal sticking out of his leg, had burns across her arms and a wound on her head that had painted half her face red. But they were still standing, still holding their weapons, still watching the gap in the wall for any sign of another attack. Or asked how they had done it. How had 7 humans held against hundreds of enemies for so long? Looked at him with those green eyes and gave a tired smile. "We just didn't quit," she said. Or returned his attention to the cadets. Their faces were pale now, their earlier confidence completely gone. "I learned something important at Hollow Ridge," he told them. "I learned that humans have a strength that cannot be measured by the size of their muscles or the thickness of their armor. Their strength comes from somewhere inside, from their hearts, from their spirits, from whatever force drives them to keep fighting when all logic says they should stop." He clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. The commanders later analyzed the breach at Hollow Ridge. They could not understand what had happened. Their tactical computers calculated that the humans should have fallen within the first 2 hours. The numbers did not make sense. The outcome should have been impossible. Or leaned forward, his amber eyes intense. But humans do not care about what should be possible. They do not listen to calculations or odds. They simply decide what they want to happen, and then they make it happen through sheer stubborn will. He straightened up and folded his arms again. The reinforcements arrived 3 days after the breach. By then, they had pulled back, not because they were defeated militarily. They still had superior numbers. They still had better weapons and supplies. They retreated because their soldiers refused to attack the eastern barricade again. They had lost their will to fight against creatures who simply would not die. Or let out another clicking laugh, but there was no humor in it. That is the human secret. That is what makes them so dangerous. They do not break. No matter how much pain you cause them, no matter how hopeless the situation becomes, they do not break, and eventually their enemies do. He picked up his glass of water and drained it completely. Cole received a medal for her actions at Hollow Ridge. She tried to refuse it. She said she had only done what any soldier would do, but I knew the truth. I had watched soldiers of many species face similar situations. None of them did what she did. None of them could. He set down the empty glass with a soft click. Humans are different, and that difference will haunt your nightmares if you ever stand against them. Amphitheater had grown very quiet, or noticed that some of the cadets had moved to the edges of their seats. Others had pulled out recording devices to capture his words. Good. These stories needed to be remembered. These lessons needed to be passed down. He stretched his mechanical arm, feeling the familiar hum of its servos. The replacement limb worked well enough, but it never felt quite right. It was a constant reminder of the war, of the things he had seen and done, of the humans who had terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. My third story takes place underground, or began, on a fortress world called. He explained that was a key stronghold. The planet itself was almost entirely covered by a network of tunnels and bunkers. These passages ran for thousands of kilometers in every direction, deep beneath the surface. They had built them over centuries, creating an underground maze that was nearly impossible to navigate. Somewhere in that maze was a hive nest, a breeding ground where they grew their soldiers. Intelligence reports suggested that the nest was producing thousands of new warriors every cycle. If it was not destroyed, they would eventually overwhelm the coalition through sheer numbers. The mission was simple in theory: find the hive nest, destroy it, get out alive. In practice, it was considered suicide. Coalition Command assembled a special unit for the operation. They selected soldiers from species known for their ability to fight in tight spaces, with their natural armor, with their ability to see in total darkness, and humans who had volunteered for the mission despite being warned of the dangers. Or was assigned to this unit. He did not want to go. The thought of fighting in those narrow tunnels, surrounded by rock and darkness, filled him with dread, but he was a soldier and soldiers followed orders. The human leading their squad was a man named Jake Harmon. He was a lieutenant from a place on Earth called Montana, or had never heard of Montana, but Jake spoke of it often. He talked about mountains and rivers and wide open spaces where you could see for kilometers in every direction. He seemed to miss it very much. Jake was not like other human soldiers or had met. He was quiet and soft-spoken. He never raised his voice or made dramatic gestures. He carried only a sidearm and a small pack of equipment. He looked more like a scholar than a warrior. But they had given him a name in their own language. They called him the Ghost. Or did not understand why at first. Jake seemed so ordinary, so calm, so unremarkable, but as their squad descended into the tunnels he began to see the truth. Jake moved through the darkness like he was born in it. He seemed to know where every trap was hidden before they reached it. He disabled alarm systems with casual ease. He navigated intersections without hesitation, as if he had memorized every twist and turn of the endless maze. The soldiers, who prided themselves on their stealth abilities, watched Jake with something close to awe. They could not understand how a human, with his weak eyes and loud footsteps, could move so silently. They asked him his secret. Jake just shrugged and said, "Practice." The squad traveled deeper into the tunnels than any coalition force had gone before. They passed through chambers filled with strange machinery and corridors lined with symbols. The air grew thick and hot as they approached the heart of the underground complex. And then they reached Tunnel 7. Or remembered the moment vividly. The tunnel was narrow and curved sharply to the left. Jake held up his hand, signaling the squad to stop. He pressed his ear against the wall and listened. Then he turned to face them with an expression that made Orr's blood run cold. "Ambush ahead," Jake whispered. "At least 60 of them, maybe more." The squad exchanged nervous glances. 60 in a tunnel this narrow would be a massacre. There was no room to maneuver, no cover to hide behind. They would be cut down before they could fire a single shot. The other soldiers started talking about retreating. They could find another route. They could call for backup. They could wait for better intelligence. Jake shook his head. "No time," he said. "They know we're here. If we retreat, they'll collapse the tunnels and bury us. Our only way out is through." He reached into his pack and pulled out 3 small devices, or recognized them as explosive charges, powerful enough to bring down a small building. In these tight tunnels, they would be devastating. Jake turned to the squad and gave clear, simple instructions. They would retreat to a junction they had passed earlier. They would hold that position and wait. No matter what they heard, no matter how long it took, they would wait. One of them asked the obvious question, "What about you?" Jake smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had accepted something terrible. "I'm going to introduce myself to our friends," he said. Before anyone could argue, Jake slipped into the darkness and disappeared. The squad retreated to the junction as ordered. They took defensive positions and waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. The tunnel was silent except for the distant drip of water and the nervous breathing of frightened soldiers. Then they heard it, an explosion so loud it shook the walls around them. Dust rained from the ceiling. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Another explosion followed, then another, and then screaming, screaming, the high-pitched wail of creatures dying in agony. And then silence. The squad waited. They waited for what felt like forever. Some of them wanted to go back to look for Jake to see what had happened, but they remembered his orders. They stayed. 3 days passed. 3 days without food, without water, without knowing if they would ever see the surface again. Some soldiers began to lose hope. Some began to pray. One warrior simply sat in a corner and stared at the wall, his mind broken by the waiting. And then Jake appeared. He walked out of the darkness like a spirit rising from the dead. His uniform was torn and covered in dried blood. His face was pale and his lips were cracked from dehydration. He could barely stand. But he was carrying someone on his back, a scout who had gone missing during the explosions. Jake had found him buried under rubble, still alive, and had carried him through kilometers of collapsed tunnels to reach the squad. Or rushed forward to help. He took the wounded scout from Jake's back and laid him gently on the ground. Then he turned to Jake with a question burning in his mind. "How?" he asked. "How did you survive?" Jake sat down heavily against the tunnel wall. He closed his eyes and took a long, shaky breath. "The explosion collapsed their position," he said quietly. "But there was a ventilation shaft nearby. I remembered seeing it on the way in. I crawled through it. Took 3 days to find a way back to you." Or stared at him in disbelief. Jake had collapsed an entire section of the tunnel network, killing over 200 soldiers. He had survived the explosion. He had crawled through ventilation shafts for 3 days, and he had done it all while carrying a wounded soldier on his back. The cadets in the amphitheater were completely silent now, or could see the fear in their eyes, the understanding. They were beginning to grasp what humans truly were. Jake Harmon received many honors for what he did on, or said. The coalition called him a hero, they called him a demon, but when I asked Jake what he called himself, he just laughed and said he was a guy from Montana who wanted to go home. Or shook his head slowly. That is the most terrifying thing about humans. They do not see themselves as extraordinary. They do not think their actions are special or heroic. They simply do what needs to be done, no matter how impossible it seems. And then they go back to their ordinary lives as if nothing happened. He looked up at the cadets with tired eyes. Humans see death differently than we do. To them, it is not an ending to be feared. It is a price to be paid, a tool to be used. They spend their lives like currency, trading them for victory without hesitation. He paused and let out a long, slow breath. And that is why you should fear them, because a creature that does not fear death cannot be stopped. It can only be survived, or walked slowly across the amphitheater floor. His joints ached from standing so long, but he could not sit. Not for this story. This one demanded that he stand, that he bear witness properly to what he had seen. The cadets watched him with wide eyes. All their earlier bravado had vanished. They had come to this lecture expecting stories of glory and victory. Instead, they were learning about terror, about a species that everything they thought they knew about war. Or stopped in the center of the room and stood very still. He gathered his thoughts carefully. This next account was the most difficult to tell. It was the memory that woke him in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, hearts pounding with remembered fear. My fourth story, he began slowly, takes place in space, at a station called Orion's Gate. He explained that Orion's Gate was a massive structure floating at the edge of Coalition territory. It served as a command center, a supply depot, and the last line of defense against the main armada. Thousands of soldiers were stationed there, along with millions of tons of weapons and equipment. The Coalition believed Orion's Gate was impregnable. It had the strongest shields in the fleet. It had weapons platforms that could destroy entire battle cruisers. It had layers of armor thick enough to withstand nuclear strikes. They proved them wrong. The enemy came with a fleet larger than anything the Coalition had ever seen. Hundreds of warships, thousands of fighters, and one massive command vessel that dwarfed everything around it. They hit Orion's Gate with everything they had. The battle lasted 6 hours before the station's shields finally failed. Or was on Orion's Gate when it happened. He remembered the moment the shield generators exploded, the lights flickered, alarms screamed, and then the hull breaches began. Boarding pods punched through the station's armor like needles through fabric. Enemy soldiers poured into the corridors, killing everyone they found. Panic spread through the station like wildfire. Soldiers of every species ran for the escape pods and evacuation shuttles. But the humans stayed. Orr's voice grew heavy as he continued. There were just over 200 humans on Orion's Gate. Soldiers, engineers, medics, technicians. They were led by a captain named Lisa. He described Lisa as a woman of average height with dark hair cut short and brown eyes that never seemed to blink. She had a calm voice and steady hands. She walked through chaos like she was taking a stroll through a garden. When the evacuation order was given, Lisa gathered her human crew. She looked at each of them in turn. Engineers covered in grease, medics with blood on their hands, soldiers with fear in their eyes. She spoke to them simply and directly. The reactor core is all that matters, she said. If we can keep the away from it long enough, we can overload it. Take out the station, their command ship, maybe more. But someone has to stay and make that happen. She paused and looked at the evacuation corridors. where alien soldiers were pushing and shoving to reach the escape pods. "I'm staying. Anyone who wants to leave should go now. No judgment, no shame." Not a single human moved toward the evacuation corridors, or had been nearby when this happened. He was wounded, bleeding from a gash on his side, trying to reach an escape shuttle. He watched the humans seal the bulkheads behind them, cutting themselves off from any hope of escape. He tried to go to them, tried to offer his help, but a human medic named Tony blocked his path. "You're hurt," Tony said. "Get to an pod, we've got this." Or protested. He was a warrior, he should stay and fight. Tony just smiled sadly and shook his head. "Not this time, friend. This fight is ours. But do me a favor. When you get out of here, tell people what happened. Tell them we didn't run." Then Tony turned and jogged back toward the reactor core, disappearing into the smoke-filled corridor. Or made it to an evacuation shuttle. As the small craft pulled away from the station, he pressed his face against the viewport and watched. Orion's gate was surrounded by ships. Boarding pods continued to slam into its hull. Explosions bloomed across its surface like flowers of fire. It was dying. But inside that dying station, 200 humans were fighting. Or learned later what they had done. Lisa had organized her people into defensive teams. They used the station's own systems against the invaders. They vented compartments into space, sucking soldiers into the void. They overloaded power conduits, turning corridors into electric death traps. They sealed doors and opened others, channeling the enemy into kill zones. For 6 hours, those 200 humans held the reactor core against thousands of soldiers. 6 hours. Or repeated those words, letting them hang in the air of the amphitheater. "Do you understand what that means?" he asked the cadets. 200 against thousands, in a station that was falling apart around them, with no hope of survival. They held for 6 hours. The cadets said nothing. Some of them had tears in their eyes, others looked like they might be sick. Or continued his story. When the reactor finally went critical, the explosion was visible from 3 star systems away. The blast destroyed Orion's gate completely. It also destroyed the command ship and 47 other enemy vessels. The entire offensive collapsed in that single moment. But before the explosion, Lisa sent one final transmission. It was broadcast across the entire coalition fleet, or had heard it with his own ears, sitting in that evacuation shuttle, watching the station disappear in a ball of white fire. Lisa's voice was calm, almost casual, like she was reporting the weather or reading a shopping list. "Coalition Command, this is Captain Lisa on Orion's gate. Reactor overload initiated. Estimate 30 seconds to detonation. Enemy command ship is within blast radius. Should be quite a show." There was a pause, or remembered hearing other sounds in the background. Weapons fire, explosions, screaming. Then Lisa spoke again. "Tell them we didn't run." The transmission ended. 30 seconds later, Orion's gate ceased to exist. Or stood in silence for a long moment. The memory was still painful, even after all these cycles. He could still see the flash of the explosion, could still hear Lisa's voice, calm and steady as she faced her death. "I have asked myself many times," Or said quietly, "what drove those humans to stay? They could have evacuated, they could have lived, but they chose to die instead." He looked up at the cadets with eyes that had seen too much. "For a long time I did not understand. In culture, survival is the highest priority. We fight to live. We retreat when victory is impossible. We do not throw away our lives for abstract concepts." He shook his head slowly. "But humans are different. They do not fight to survive. They fight to matter. They fight because they believe some things are worth dying for: victory, honor, protecting others. These ideas mean more to them than their own lives." He paused and let out a heavy breath. "That is what makes them so dangerous. A soldier who fights to live can be broken. You can scare him, you can hurt him, you can make him run. but a soldier who fights to matter cannot be broken, because even in death he achieves his goal, even in defeat he wins. Or walked back to the center of the amphitheater. The humans of Orion's Gate did not survive, but they won. They stopped the offensive. They saved millions of lives. They became legends that are still told across the galaxy. He looked at the cadets with fierce intensity. And every time a soldier hears the name Orion's Gate, he remembers what humans are capable of. He remembers that there is a species willing to trade their lives for victory, and he is afraid. Or nodded slowly. As he should be, as you should be, because if humans are willing to die like that for strangers they never met, imagine what they would do for people they actually love. Amphitheater was completely silent, or could hear the soft hum of the ventilation systems and the distant footsteps of soldiers walking through the corridors outside. The cadets sat frozen in their seats, their young minds struggling to process everything they had heard. Or felt tired. The memories he had shared were heavy things, and carrying them for so long had worn him down. But there was one more story to tell, one more lesson to teach, and this one was perhaps the most important of all. He walked slowly to the metal chair in the center of the room and finally sat down. His old joints creaked in relief. His mechanical arm clicked softly as he folded his hands in his lap. After the Terminus War ended, he began, I was invited to Earth as part of a diplomatic exchange. The coalition wanted to strengthen ties with humanity, and veterans like myself were chosen to represent our species. He paused, remembering the journey, the long flight through unfamiliar space, the strange blue and green planet growing larger in the viewport, the nervous anticipation of setting foot on the human. I expected to find a world of warriors, or admitted. After everything I had seen, I thought Earth must be a harsh place, a brutal civilization that forged its people in fire and blood. How else could humans become such fearsome soldiers? He shook his head and let out a soft clicking sound. I was wrong again. He told the cadets about his first days on Earth. He had landed in a place called California, on the western edge of a nation called America. The weather was warm and the sky was a brilliant blue. There were buildings taller than any he had seen, and roads filled with strange vehicles that moved without visible weapons or armor. But what struck him most were the people. Everywhere he looked, he saw humans doing ordinary things. They walked through parks and sat on benches. They played games and ate food and laughed at jokes he did not understand. Children ran across open fields, chasing balls and each other, screaming with joy instead of fear. There was no sign of the warriors he had expected, no military camps or weapons factories, no training grounds where young humans learned to kill, just people living their lives in peace. Or was confused. He could not reconcile what he was seeing with what he had experienced during the war. These soft, gentle creatures could not be the same species that had held Hollow Ridge, that had survived the tunnels of, that had sacrificed themselves at Orion's Gate. And then he met Danny Vance again. Danny was the human from his first story, the soldier who had taken 2 plasma bolts to the shoulder and kept fighting with nothing but a knife, the man who had killed 9 soldiers with 1 working arm. Danny had retired from the military after the war. He now lived in a small town on the coast, in a little house with a garden and a view of the ocean, or traveled there to visit him, curious to see what had become of the warrior who had first shown him the terrifying nature of humanity. The man who greeted or at the door looked nothing like a soldier. Danny had grown older and softer. His hair was graying at the edges. His face was lined with wrinkles from smiling too much. He wore simple clothes and walked without weapons. Danny smiled when he saw Orr and welcomed him inside like an old friend. The house was small but comfortable. There were pictures on the walls showing Danny with other humans. Some were soldiers from the war. Others were people Orr did not recognize. There were flowers in vases and books on shelves and a strange device that played music. Danny introduced Or to his family. His wife was a woman named with kind eyes and a gentle voice. Their 2 children were young, barely old enough to walk, with round faces and curious expressions. They looked at Or with wonder instead of fear, reaching out tiny hands to touch his carapace. Or was overwhelmed. This peaceful home, this loving family, this ordinary life. How could any of this exist in the same reality as the horrors he had witnessed? Danny seemed to understand his confusion. He invited Or to sit down and share a meal with them. As they ate, Danny talked about his life after the war. He spoke about fishing and gardening and fixing things around the house. He talked about watching his children grow and teaching them to ride bicycles and reading them stories before bed. There was no mention of the war. No talk of battles or killing or the terrible things they had both seen. It was as if that part of Danny's life existed in a different universe. Finally, Or could not contain his question any longer. "How?" he asked. "How can you be this person now? How can you live this peaceful life after everything you did, after the things I watched you do?" Danny was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his wife and children who were playing together in the next room. His eyes were soft, but there was something deeper there. Something ancient and powerful hiding beneath the surface. "You want to know why humans fight the way we do," Danny said. It was not a question. Or nodded. Danny gestured toward his family. His wife was laughing at something one of the children had done. The sunlight streaming through the window made them look almost golden. "We fight like that because of this," Danny said simply. "Because of them. Because of everything peaceful and good and beautiful in our lives." Or still did not understand. Danny saw his confusion and tried to explain. "We're not monsters, Or. We don't enjoy killing. We don't love war. Every human soldier I've ever known would rather be home with their family than fighting on some distant world." He paused and took a deep breath. "But when something threatens the people we love, something changes inside us. We stop being ordinary. We stop thinking about ourselves. All that matters is protecting the things that matter most." Danny looked at Or with eyes that suddenly seemed very old. "That's the secret. That's why humans can do impossible things in battle. It's not because we're brave or tough or special. It's because we have something worth fighting for. Something so precious that no sacrifice is too great to protect it." He smiled sadly. "You saw me at my worst during the war. You saw what I became when I had no choice. But this, right here, this is who I really am. This is who all of us really are. The warrior is just what happens when something threatens the person." Or sat in silence, finally beginning to understand. He looked out the window at the peaceful world beyond. The blue sky, the green grass, the children playing without fear. This was what humans fought for. This was what they killed for. This was what they died for. Not conquest, not glory, not power. Just this, just home, just the people they loved. Or rose from his chair in the amphitheater. The cadets watched him with new understanding in their eyes. They were beginning to grasp the truth that had taken him so long to see. "I stayed on Earth for 3 months, Or told them. I traveled to many places and met many humans, and everywhere I went I found the same thing. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. Farmers and teachers and builders and artists. People who wanted nothing more than peace and happiness." He walked toward the exit of the amphitheater, then stopped and turned to face the cadets one last time. "But remember what I told you. Remember the battles I described. Remember the warriors who refused to die. Those same ordinary people become something else entirely when their peaceful lives are threatened." He pointed at the cadets with one gnarled claw. "If you ever face humans in battle, pray that they have nothing left to lose. Pray that they have forgotten what they are fighting for. Because if a human still has something to protect, if they still have someone waiting for them at home, they will do anything to survive, anything to win, anything to return to the people they love." He lowered his arm and shook his head slowly. And against that kind of determination, no amount of training or weapons or numbers will save you. Or turned and limped toward the exit. His old body ached. His mechanical arm clicked with each step, but his mind was at peace. He had done what he came to do. He had passed on the lessons that might one day save these young soldiers' lives. As he reached the door, he spoke one final time without turning around. "Class dismissed, and may you never face a human in battle." The door closed behind him, leaving the cadets in stunned silence. They sat in their seats for a long time afterward, thinking about everything they had heard. And in their hearts, a new understanding took root, an understanding that would stay with them forever. Humans were not to be underestimated, humans were not to be provoked, and humans were never, ever to be threatened. Because beneath their soft exterior, beneath their peaceful lives and gentle smiles, there lived something ancient and terrible, something that only emerged when everything they loved was in danger. And once it emerged, it could not be stopped. It could only be survived.